Good morning, everyone. And I realized that we didn't stop to welcome everyone by name this morning, but for those of you who'd like to wonder who those silhouettes are in the sanctuary, Harriet and Sue and Faith and Annie are here in the pews. And of course, Odin on the organ today, and Johnny at the console, making sure all of this comes to you. Here we are. It's the fifth Sunday of Lent. Lent, that season before Easter, when we are approaching Jerusalem with Jesus, approaching the day of his triumphal entry, then his arrest and crucifixion, and his rising. The pace is picking up, and we know that we will have a very fast week, just a few weeks from now. There's a lot of momentum here. There's a lot of anticipation. And we've been hearing some stories. If they're familiar to you, it may be even hard to get any new ideas. But if they're new, it may be hard to follow them. So here's what's important from my point of view. These are stories about the human condition, what it's like to be human. Those moments when we can't figure out what's going on, when we can't see. The human condition, those moments when we can't remember how many people we have hurt, how many people we have not helped. And these stories ask us, what do we believe? What do we believe about Jesus, about his healing touch, about his forgiveness, about his unlimited welcome? And what do we hope for ourselves when we say, have mercy? What do we hope for? And so these stories are an invitation to transformation. Now, the four Gospels tell Jesus' story in some quite different ways. When we hear the stories from Luke, we get a particular emphasis on the poor, on the struggling, on the marginalized. Luke is known as a friend of sinners and of tax collectors, who are not known to be poor, but are almost universally considered sinners by their fellow Jews. And on this day, Jesus reminds his 12 disciples what is coming, and he walks toward Jericho, which is the last big city before Jerusalem. A blind man is there outside the gates. He is wondering what's happening. Now, we've been traveling with Jesus all these weeks, so we remember the stories he's been teaching, the parables, the Good Samaritan, the lost sheep and the lost coin, the prodigal son, the rich man, and Lazarus. We remember those stories, although we haven't been hearing as much here in church the other events that surround those stories, Jesus' healing gestures, his visits with friends, his many meals. And all these stories and parables together for Luke are a way to reveal just who Jesus is. And this passage today, these stories, gives us three stories that fit together in an interesting way. They begin with Jesus pausing to say to his 12 disciples what will happen in Jerusalem, and he refers to himself as the Son of Man. And they go on. They come to the gates of Jericho. They've not even entered the city, but a blind man calls for mercy. And after a healing action there, Jesus and the disciples and the followers enter into the city. They're only going to pass through the city because it's less than a day's walk up the mountain to Jerusalem. But there is Zacchaeus, who has climbed a tree to see who Jesus was. On a dime? Well, not a dime. Some kind of a small coin. Jesus abruptly stops. He declares he must stay at the house of Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector. So we're reminded who Jesus is by how he chooses to interact with people and how people interact with him. We understand that the public approval of an individual person or the public condemnation don't predict how Jesus is going to respond, because both the blind man and the tax collector were outside the bounds of the mainstream of society. And so what we see is that every step of the way, Jesus is teaching. He is teaching how to live. I mentioned that Jesus said, everything that is written about the Son of Man by the prophets will be accomplished. And I think most of the words in that passage are at least familiar in our everyday English, if not totally clear. But this idea of the Son of Man, what could it possibly mean? Now, in Greek, it's hahuios to theou. It's a very awkward phrase in Greek, and it is probably translated from the Aramaic, which was the common language of the people, where it was bar nasha. And bar nasha could mean many things. It could mean a man. It could mean humankind in general. It could mean someone. Some people think that it might be a roundabout way of saying I or me. Like if I said, yours truly, you would know I was referring to myself. Literally, these words mean the Son of Man, the man, or the human being. And it's a little bit like a title like Son of David, which the blind man calls Jesus, like Lord, like Messiah, like King of the Jews. Only Jesus applies it to himself, and it's associated with Jesus' ministry. But it's not like a title in this way. It doesn't tell us anything about who Jesus is in relationship to the Jewish teachings, the way all the other titles do. No one asks a question. No one about the Son of Man. No one calls him the Son of Man. Jesus only calls himself the Son of Man, only Jesus. So if this phrase, Son of Man, doesn't tell us who Jesus is, it doesn't tell us Messiah, Son of David, Son of God, what is its meaning? It's difficult to say, but perhaps we can most often best translate it, this man. But what's happened over the course of this first century, from the time of Jesus through the time that Luke is writing this gospel, this phrase, the Son of Man, has become something with a deep symbolism for people. It's never explained to us. Is Jesus just saying me in an obscure way? Well, maybe he's being deliberately oblique or ambiguous. Because what if someone not one of his followers, but someone who was wishing to do him ill, heard him say that he was indeed the Son of God, which he never does say? That could be dangerous. But if he says, this man, who can object? So who can object to Jesus? Who can object? Well, we know the story. They move on. Jesus, the disciples, the crowds that follow him, it's a procession, a chaotic one. And as he passes by, this blind beggar calls out, Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth, Son of David, give mercy on me. Have mercy on me. Now, how did he know that it was Jesus passing by? How did he know? He could not see. He must have asked, and someone told him. This is Jesus of Nazareth passing by. And even if he couldn't see, he had heard the stories preceding Jesus and this entourage. Jesus, the healer. Jesus, the one who includes everyone. Jesus, the friend of sinners and tax collectors. And we do remember, of course, that there was this idea that if you had a physical ailment, if you were blind, it meant that you were a sinner, that this was a punishment from God. But this man hopes to have his sight restored. He hopes to be transformed. Jericho was an ideal spot for begging, by the way, because the Romans had further developed Jericho as a city. It was a city of trade. It was a city where pilgrims passed through on their way to Jerusalem. It was a city where the tax collectors could collect much money from all of the goods coming through the city. It was an ideal site for begging, but this blind beggar didn't want to continue begging. Begging is truly hand to mouth. It is truly a precarious position. He wanted to be with the community. He wanted to have a place and a home. So, one of the ways that the early Christians read this passage was as a call to make everyone part of the Christian community, blind or deaf or crippled, widowed, poor, parentless. Today, we don't have the same individual intimacy, for the most part, with people who are begging. But I found an interesting article by Quinbert Kununda, who writes from southern Africa. And he says, are the African nations doomed to beg? And he expands this story. He notes that under globalization, under the kinds of economic development that have been set upon the African nations, more and more people are leaving their villages and going to the cities, and many of them end up begging because there is not sufficient work for them there. And alms are given on the street kind of as a way of keeping people quiet and of avoiding any big economic changes. There's no working system to integrate everyone into society. So this is an effect of globalization. And so is the effect of nations, African nations, begging the richer nations for support. It could be food in place of famine. It could be money for economic development. It could be even inviting corporations into their countries to develop industries with the hope that it would improve the well-being of the people. But Kanunda tells us that this kind of aid promotes corruption. It has led to more beggars in the street. Leaders often will take this money and invest it in foreign banks for their own benefit. They send their children abroad for education and medical care, and so they have no incentive themselves to build up their own communities' systems. How can this be changed, says Kanunda? He says we need empowerment. So like the blind man begging, we need correct information. We don't need distortions of how things work, of facts, to draw us into the net of debt. We need participation and social integration. You'll remember that the blind man was rebuked, and yet here, he is included. He had been oppressed. Now he is liberated. Insecure. Now that he can see, he can again work. He can again provide for himself. People need freedom of speech, and they need good governance. And Kanunda holds up Jesus as a model of governance. He says, decentralization of power. What do you want me to do for you? Not I can do this for you. People can express their real needs. So physical healing, psychological healing, religious and sociocultural healing, political healing, economic healing, all of these aspects of society are what are needed to set aside this predominance of identity of these African nations as begging nations. Kanunda wants to know, can there be development without aid? And if not, is there aid which respects human dignity, which loves, which is altruistic, which is forgiving, which creates equity and impartiality, compassion, a desire to work for justice and peace, and finally, joy. Is there a way of development? So Jesus has healed the blind man. The blind man has joined the procession, praising God, and the procession moves on and enters Jericho. We thought that they would just pass through, but there's Zacchaeus. He's climbed up a tree. He's climbed up a tree because he's supposedly short. Now, this word for short in Greek can also mean immature. It can also mean without character. And so, without saying in so many words, Zacchaeus is called a man of little character. He's not just a tax collector. He is considered a hated traitor and a sinner extraordinaire. His relationship with God is broken, and his social relationships as well. Can he be saved? Can he find mercy? In a parable earlier, or in a story earlier in the gospel, Jesus talks about how hard it is for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven, for a rich person to receive forgiveness and to know relief, to know freedom. But here, Jesus shows that it's not impossible. Zacchaeus is eager to see Jesus. He's insistent on seeing Jesus, so determined that although he may have commonly conducted himself about the city with dignity and propriety, here he climbs a tree like a child. He wants to see. He's impelled to know Jesus. Zacchaeus shows us the human condition, the difficulties that we have finding our way to the character that we wish to cultivate, finding our way to relationship with God and participation in community. But the rumors about Jesus have preceded this crowd, and they went past the gate, of course, and they reached Jericho. Jesus is a friend of sinners and tax collectors. And when Jesus looks up and says, "I must stay at your house," this is not like I'm inviting myself over in a, "Can I stay with you?" He's saying, "I'm going to stay with you." And this launches an enormous transformation, because Zacchaeus essentially confesses. He says, "Okay, I'll give half my wealth to the poor, and to those I have defrauded, I will give 4 times. Charity and justice. Transformation is possible. And as Jesus has said, his mission is to seek and save the lost. And already, walking toward Jerusalem, he has found and welcomed 2. And maybe more, because we don't know who else in the crowd took Jesus' method and invitation to heart. Zacchaeus is a model of transformation for us. What would this kind of transformation look like in a global context? Gosbert Bayomungu writes about this, and he says, we have to extend this idea of oikos, house, to mean not just house and home, more than family, more than church, more than city, more than nation or world, all the way to cosmos. We have to understand that we share this house together. We are staying in this house together. And this oikos, this house, also symbolizes our soul. And we invite Jesus in as a guest of honor to transform our lives, our souls. So if we climb today's trees to get a better perspective, or if we shout out, "Have mercy on me," if we break the rules and welcome Jesus everywhere in our lives, what would happen? What can happen? Bayomungu says, there will always be some crowd to obstruct the new visions, always the possibility to use those obstructions as stepping stones toward better perspective. Because we do not want to miss this kairos of transforming grace. Today, salvation has come to this house, said Jesus. Today, healing has come to this house. Healing, salvation, the same word in Greek. Salvation, not a word we use every day, but healing, closer to our own vocabulary. Making oneself vulnerable as did the blind man calling out, Jesus, have mercy on me, as Zacchaeus did, making himself ridiculous up in the tree. Salvation, healing can come to this house. Now, is this healing, is this a one-time change? Can we simply once say to Jesus, welcome in. I confess. I will restore. I will give and give and give. Most of us say no, that this isn't a one-time option to welcome Jesus, that we will be welcoming Jesus again and again, that Jesus is always there to welcome. We're always on the road to Jericho. We are always in a tree. We are always in a place where we can slow down, listen, ask questions, respond, open our hearts, and join Jesus and all the disciples and all of the followers and the crowds around them on the way to Jerusalem. Amen.